The musical biopic is having a bit of a renaissance.
Recent films such as Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocket Man not only made a ton of money at the box office, but also went on to nab a few Oscars. This movie won for Best Editing. How did this happen?
You get up here and you're completely blank.
Studios have recognized these biopics, love them or hate them, as potential lucrative blockbusters. We currently have the upcoming Aretha Franklin biopic, along with an Amy Winehouse one in production. The new Baz Luhrmann movie about Elvis is underway. The likes of Queen, Johnny Cash, Ray Charles, Elton John, Jim Morrison inspired all these high-grossing and critically acclaimed films. You might be asking, where is the most obvious entry to this list of movies about musical artists? Where is the movie about the Beatles? I'm not talking about Beatles films like A Hard Day's Night or Help, or documentaries like Let It Be, or the highly anticipated upcoming Peter Jackson documentary about their final recording sessions. I also don't mean films about the Beatles like Yesterday or Across the Universe, which I may save for another video. I mean a live action movie that tells the story of the Beatles. Where is it? Well, it exists. Kind of. The Beatles were a pretty famous band, and a lot happened to them and because of them over about the course of 13 years, from when they formed to when they eventually broke up and beyond. It's not exactly easy to condense all of these very well documented events into a single 2.5-hour film, but there are many examples of films about, say, the band's early days, or films about John Lennon in particular that have been around for decades. In total, there are 7 films that depict the Beatles in one form or another that I'll be discussing in this video. I'm going to work chronologically, so we'll start with the earliest film about the Beatles and work our way up to the present. And hey, while you're here, don't forget to like the video and feel free to subscribe so you can see more of my stuff in future. So get ready for a bunch of bad wigs, bad accents, and a whole lot of 8 days a week references.
Play 8 days a week.
Pubs are always open 8 days a week.
We begin with the very first movie ever made about the Beatles, aptly titled The Birth of the Beatles. Made in 1979 and produced by Dick Clark, this is the only film made about the band from when John Lennon was still alive, and it's oddly enough the only film made about literally just the band, the Beatles. No Beatle in particular, no friend or family member of a Beatle whose perspective we're seeing this from, but just a straight up story of 4 guys from Liverpool playing gigs, getting signed, and ending with their performance on the Ed Sullivan Show having made it as the biggest band in the world. It was directed by Return of the Jedi director Richard Marquand. Marquand? I don't know. Oh, something I should mention about this film is that Pete Best, aka the Beatles drummer of 2 years before they ditched him for Ringo Starr, served as the film's technical advisor. And as such, we get a bit of a biased view of some of the early events, such as people considering Pete Best to be the most talented member of the band.
You're sick of the girls liking him and saying Pete Best and the Beatles.
Maybe, Dr. Sigmund Eppie, maybe.
And just a general bloating of his significance in the early days.
They think Ringo's a better drummer.
That ain't true. Oh, I know it. You know it. Well, even Ringo knows it. All of Liverpool knows it.
What astonishingly handsome Peter Best that he sobs. The record company heard his drumming. They liked it.
They didn't. In fact, George Martin has gone on record as saying he heard Pete Best drumming and immediately knew that they needed a new drummer.
And I said to Brian Epstein, when we do the next session, I mean, I don't want to interfere with the Beatles and what you're doing with them, that's fine. But I'm going to provide the drummer.
And if you know anything about the Beatles from those days, you'll know that you had John, Paul, and George who had all this kind of stage banter. They were really funny. Paul and John were writing all these songs, and Pete Best was really just kind of to the side.
Why have they all got their hair cut one way and you haven't? Nobody ever asked me. Why? Just wondered.
Like, he didn't really ever include himself, he was a bit of a loner, so they ditched him. Overall, for 1979, this is a pretty fun film and well told. It's certainly aged by today's standards, but all the actors look like who they're portraying, and Stephen McKenna, who plays John Lennon, is really very good, despite being 35 years old playing someone who's meant to be in his early 20s. There is some bad accent work from the guy who plays Paul.
No bad habits to Len.
And the biased approach to the film, thanks to Pete Best, diminishes the credibility, but only slightly. Certain scenes, like the one where John is completely accepting and kind to their manager Brian Epstein as they're discussing his homosexuality, are really quite remarkable in terms of how progressive they were. I mean, remember, this was 1979.
So ashamed, John.
You know, it's all right, Brian. Nothing to be ashamed of, you know. Any loving. Anything between people that's loving's all right. There's too much pain in this world. Don't matter to us, Eppie.
There's other tender moments as well, like between John and Stuart Sutcliffe, but some of the more dramatic storytelling devices from the 1970s have aged pretty hilariously.
Q's dead.
The The band Rain, who were the first of many famous Beatles tribute bands, do a fantastic job of recreating the Beatles' music. And the actors do a great job of acting the physical performance of the playing. There's a lot of live performance scenes, so it's a credit that they got it right. A strong entry into the list, and if you're looking for a movie that just tells the story of the early years of the Beatles without focusing on anything else, then this is it.
Can't get no worse.
Next up is John and Yoko, A Love Story, the first of many made-for-TV movies we'll be looking at. Made in 1985, and as the title suggests, it's primarily a story about John and Yoko. The first hour is mostly Beatles-related, with another hour and a half pertaining to John and Yoko in the 70s all the way to Lennon's death, making this the longest entry into this list of Beatles biopics. The story starts off in 1966, when the group, led by John, declares to their manager that they want to stop touring.
Squeezing 10 songs into 20 minutes for a herd of screaming banshees. I'm bloody sick of it.
We see John meet Yoko in an art gallery to a lovely instrumental version of Strawberry Fields Forever. And we go from there. This film, probably more than any other of the Beatles biopics, tries to give us an actual glimpse of what the in-studio mood was for the Beatles between 1967 and 1969. But of course, all we see is tension and moodiness between them all. What we don't see is the minutiae of the Beatles recording and enjoying experimenting with new sounds, which we know was happening at the time. The sense we get from this is that John and Yoko are distracted. Paul's just trying to play his Paul music.
I never give you my number.
And George is just generally pissed off with everyone. I do love the way Peter Capaldi says the word sessions here, though.
Maybe we should all bring our women into the sessions.
It's very George. Like, we get these scenes where they're rehearsing for Sgt. Pepper and Let It Be, but they're only there to serve as a backdrop to John and Yoko's blossoming relationship. I mean, like, I can't be surprised. The movie's called John and Yoko, A Love Story. I don't know what I was expecting. I think one of the most interesting scenes from this film is where their producer, George Martin, is trying to communicate to John that Revolution Number 9 doesn't fit on the album.
But John, it's experimental music.
Everything we've ever done has been experimental music. From Eleanor Rigby to Strawberry Fields. Look, George, I wanted to put that out as a single and nobody agreed with me. Now you're saying it shouldn't even be on the album.
It's just talking about its place in relation to the other songs.
What songs? Obladi Oblada.
It explores, even just for a moment, the way that their music is developing and changing and how they might scare off their target audience, and I think it's cool. It's a way of exploring their changing musical style, and it's something that I wish we got a little bit more from all of these films. We also get the boardroom scene where John announces that he's quitting the Beatles, which we'll definitely see in at least 2 more movies before this video is over.
I wasn't going to tell you, but I want out. I want a divorce.
There are also a bunch of super on-the-nose moments.
In London High Court today, Paul McCartney began proceedings to end the Beatles' partnership.
I don't believe in Beatles.
I think it was like a style of the time to showcase action dictated by the music that is happening.
Oh, Yoko.
Interestingly, the film was made in cooperation with Yoko Ono, who also controlled the song's rights. I think this also helps to reverse the popular narrative that Yoko Ono broke up the Beatles, which has always been reductive and also incorrect. Just ask Paul McCartney.
And who knows who broke, everyone has a theory.
I know.
Who broke it up?
John.
John did?
Yeah. There was a meeting where John came in and said, hey guys, I'm leaving the group.
This film helps to show that it wasn't Yoko Ono that broke up the Beatles, it was the Beatles that broke up the Beatles. It certainly shows a lot of grumpy looks from George and Paul at Yoko in the sessions, but we can see that her presence is merely exacerbating issues that are already arising, such as Paul's controlling direction towards George's playing.
Maybe if you softened up a little on those last 2 notes.
Fine. I'll play whatever you want me to play. Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play.
I was eventually won over by the chemistry between the 2 leads. It's by far the longest of all of these biopics, and there is a lot of time given to the couple getting to know each other and forming that famous inseparable bond. Mark McGann is actually from Liverpool, and his voice sits in place better than a lot of the other actors that played John Lennon.
Mostly these days we do our own. Penny Lane is his, Strawberry Fields is mine, and so on.
Although it can tend to go from normal to that nasal John Lennon impression voice that a lot of them do.
You asked for original scores. That's how we write.
There's a lot that could be cut out of this film, but there are some scenes that explore some pretty interesting topics, like art as a men's club.
Do you notice that all the critics are men? The art world's a man's world, Critics and artists. London is worse than New York, but no place is worse than Tokyo. Tokyo, they still expect the woman to walk 10 paces behind the man.
And just the general racism that Yoko Ono has to put up with.
It's a racist country. The superiority of the Anglo-Saxon. They owned half the world, for God's sake.
I'm getting hate letters from Japan, too. Racism doesn't have national boundaries or anything like that.
Which again is pretty poignant for 1985. One of the ways this film falls down is that it does gloss over quite a few larger issues, like the whole legal dispute that dissolved the Beatles. Alan Klein was the villain there, and they kind of kept it a bit ambiguous. Was it his fault? Was it Lee Eastman's fault? No, it was definitely Alan Klein. After the Beatles break up, the film concerns itself purely with John and Yoko, and this is a video about Beatles biopic, so I will leave this one here. I'll finish by saying that it's a charming, if fairly long film that covers a lot of ground, and as such, we only get a sanitized version of the story with things like drug use and infidelities kept to a minimum. Still worth checking out, even just for Peter Capaldi as George.
It's crazy.
Okay, everyone, get ready, because we have finally arrived at our first major motion picture. Our first big Beatles biopic. I am, of course, talking about Backbeat. Arguably the most well-known Beatles biopic, even if again this movie is not really about the Beatles. Backbeat, released in 1994, depicts a kind of love triangle between John Lennon, his best mate from art school Stuart Sutcliffe, and Stu's relationship with young German photographer Astrid Kircher. The film very much begins where another film on the list, Nowhere Boy, ends. The Beatles are playing Liverpool clubs and are about to try and make a name for themselves in Hamburg, Germany, where there's a burgeoning music and art scene. Stuart Sutcliffe, a talented painter and John's best friend from art school, isn't even a musician, but John encourages him to join them on the bass guitar. One of the most interesting parts of these biopics is how they got around using the Beatles songs in their films, which are famously very expensive to use. Due to it being an early days setting, we don't actually hear any Beatles originals, but are instead treated to various songs that the group performed in Hamburg that are written and recorded by other artists. Backbeat takes an interesting approach because it doesn't hire a tribute band like the Birth of the Beatles did. But instead, subversive punk and rock musicians play the live music that you hear in the film. As a producer on the film noted, the Beatles' pre-recording stage act was very much the punk of its day. And as such, the film successfully and uniquely conveys the way the music was appreciated by audiences of the time. This means that the songs we're hearing are backed by legends such as Dave Grohl of Nirvana on drums, Thurston Moore of Sonic Youth on guitar, and Mike Mills of R.E.M. on bass, and it's really effective. The power and urgency of these old rock classics sounds so energetic and fun. The musicians do a fantastic job. I will say though that I think the vocalists are a bit of a strange choice. I mean, Dave Pirner of Soul Asylum singing as an 18-year-old Paul McCartney just sounds nothing like him. It's absurd.
Well, I got a gal with a record machine, comes to love and she's the queen.
Something that I wish more of these early days Beatles films would depict are all the non-rock and roll numbers that the group used to perform as well, like the ballads, the music hall numbers, you know, to show that they're not just Elvis copycats, but versatile musicians that can cater to hip club-going teens or to a group of German bankers that just want to hear them play Besame Mucho. Okay, so the performances. As John Lennon, we have Ian Hart, who previously played Lennon in The Hours and Times, which I didn't include in this list because it's not really a biopic, it's just a 60-minute experimental look at a fictionalized holiday that John Lennon and Brian Epstein went on. The holiday was real, but all the events in it are completely made up, so it doesn't really count. And then he played him again 19 years later in this short film about if John Lennon had left the Beatles in 1962. It's fine, it's just not what we're talking about here. He does a fairly decent job, but I never really feel much for his John Lennon. There's not that much vulnerability in his performance, and his voice falls into that nasal John Lennon trap where he often sounds very one note even though he's trying to be charismatic.
Really is the showers you're taking us to, isn't it, Mr. Gables?
I don't know, he doesn't sit in here. I think Gary Bakewell does a good job of playing Paul McCartney, and he obviously looks a hell of a lot like him. Any issue with Bakewell could be down to the direction. His appearances really play second fiddle to John, and to quote the actual Paul McCartney after seeing Backbeat, one of my annoyances about the film is that they've actually taken my rock and rollness off me. They give John the song Long Tall Sally to sing, and he never sang it in his life. But now it's set in cement. I was quite taken, however, with Stephen Dorff's astonishing performance as Stu. This is a fair comment on the film from McCartney, whose character gets completely sidelined as the band's de facto manager.
This band,
What he's saying is, we'll be there.
Only ever speaking when it's to do with how the band is progressing and how concerned he is with Stu's playing.
It's about Stu. He just stands there. All he does is stand there.
Listen, John, this group can't carry Stu. You know that, don't you? We can't go on like this. The joke's over.
Half the time he doesn't turn up. When he does, he's in the fifth dimension.
He just has no real involvement in the main story arcs of John, Stu, and Astrid. Featured even less is Chris O'Neill playing George Harrison, who, although looks like he's pushing 30...
You are how old?
18.
Gives a pretty top-notch performance and has some of the funniest lines in the film.
What is it?
Scones.
Scones?
I've made you some scones. They haven't got my scones.
I can't take scones. If the lads know you give me scones, I'll never hear the end of it.
He also manages to nail George's distinct Liverpudlian drawl to a T.
Oh yeah, we'd be quite prepared for that eventuality.
We also get these neutral scenes with Pete Best where they allude to how quiet and boring he is.
You don't say much, do you? Drummers don't talk. You must have noticed that. Just might as well be deaf and dumb, drummers. I mean, when was the last time you heard a drummer say anything? You know why, don't you? I'll tell you why. Because nobody ever fucking listens. He spoke.
I always felt in these movies that they never really knew what to do with Pete Best. I guess kind of like how the actual Beatles felt about him. McCartney, the real McCartney, was right though. The best performance by far is Stephen Dorff as Stuart Sutcliffe. He's sensitive, mysterious, and you completely buy his chemistry with Cheryl Lee playing Astrid Kircher. The real Astrid Kircher even praised the accuracy and detail of the relationship with Sutcliffe and the Beatles. And this relationship really is what the film's about, if that wasn't clear from the poster. The movie ends with the announcement of Stu's sudden death from a brain hemorrhage and the Beatles performing in suits to a live audience, seemingly just before they make it big. Despite Paul McCartney throwing shade all over this film, I think it's still worth a look, even just to get an understanding of Stuart Sutcliffe and how his presence in the Beatles inspired their style and image going forward. Its success lived beyond the film as it was turned into a short-lived stage production in 2011. Alright, let's take a break from John Lennon for at least one film and dive into some Paul action with the Linda McCartney story. And folks, we have returned to the made-for-TV movie format, which means we have returned to some truly shocking wigs. This CBS British-American film from the year 2000 tells the story of how young photographer and Beatles fan Linda Eastman meets Paul McCartney in 1967. It alternates between scenes of the 60s and then the 90s, where we learn that Linda's been diagnosed with breast cancer and ending with her tragic death. In between, we see it all, from the couple getting married, the end of the Beatles, the couple forming Wings, Paul getting arrested for cannabis possession, and John Lennon's death. As a bonus, we also get some Rolling Stones and Jim Morrison action, and so does Linda. As far as Beatles biopics go, the scenes are kind of treated in the same way as John and Yoko A Love Story, whereby the main focus is the relationship between the two Wings members, and what little we get of the actual Beatles is very much in the background. Gary Bakewell from Backbeat is back as Paul, and here he does an acceptable job of playing Paul McCartney, but like playing John Lennon, these guys are tasked with an impossible job. These are some of the most charismatic and brilliant men from the last century, identifiable by all, so when you get someone to play them in a TV movie, it can be a little hard to suspend that old disbelief.
McCartney! Who the hell do you think you are?
Most well known as Juliet from Lost, Elizabeth Mitchell playing Linda really does hold this film together. It's a great performance, and her scenes with Gary Bakewell are some of the best in the film. I do have a lot of questions for this movie, such as, why would Paul be listening to his own music with Linda in the car? And why is it one of the earliest singles that he would have been sick of hearing from playing it live all those years? Why does John Lennon look like a 50-year-old man? And why does Paul's wig look so cursed? The scenes featuring the Fab Four leave a lot to be desired. The four guys look like they just met the day they filmed. There's zero chemistry between them, and the man playing John Lennon is kind of terrible.
Obla-dee, obla-da. I hate your stinking song.
We booked a session, didn't we? Ringo, George and I have been cooling our asses for 2 bloody hours in the studio, and you don't have the bleeding decency to show up.
I mean, there's just no weight to it, and the blocking is really awkward at times.
Hey, man. We'll do it without you.
And as usual, all we get of George or Ringo is just vague annoyance at the tension between John and Paul.
What is it with you and John? What's the game? We're mates. We're supposed to hang together.
Justice for George and Ringo, I swear to God. Honestly, they're sidelined in every single one of these films. Overall, this movie does feel very made for TV. But there's plenty that works here. The scenes where Linda is battling breast cancer are genuinely moving. I also love all the recreated photos of the Beatles right down to the Sgt. Pepper cover. Yeah. While it's certainly not the story of the Beatles, what we do get is a thoughtful account of one of the most successful marriages in showbiz history. All 30 years of it. And if you don't know much about Linda McCartney, and if you can look past some of the very clunky performances...
Got to sign now, mate. He's flying back to New York tomorrow.
Needs a signed contract to give to his board.
This is a worthy, if brief, telling of her incredible story. Alright, well I hope you enjoyed that brief John Lennon break, because the rest of the films are all going to be Lennon focused. We have arrived at the fifth film we'll be talking about, In His Life, the John Lennon story. Can you think of a title that sounds more made for TV movie than that? Oh, this movie. Released the same year as the Linda McCartney story, it's all about John Lennon from about the age of 16 to 23, and it's it exists. You can break this film into 3 half-hour acts. The first act covers Lennon at school, meeting Paul and forming his pre-Beatles band The Quarrymen, forming a relationship with his biological mother, and learning of her sudden and tragic death. Basically Nowhere Boy, but we'll get to that. Act 2 is essentially the movie Backbeat, with Lennon bonding closely with his art school mate Stuart Sutcliffe, and then shipping off to Hamburg for the group to hone their act before Stu's untimely death. Act 3 sees the band signed with the help of their new manager, Brian Epstein, John's marriage to a pregnant Cynthia, and it ends with Beatlemania beginning to shake America and the world. My main gripe with this film is unfortunately the lead performance by Philip McQuillan as John Lennon, whose sole acting credit is this film. Take from that what you will. Right from the top, 3 things annoy me about him. He looks nothing like John Lennon, he sounds nothing like John Lennon, in fact he doesn't really sound like anything recognizable. His Liverpudlian accent is so bizarre and uncomfortable.
This is my band and Stu's my friend, and I'm not sending them down. Either he's in or we're both bloody out.
Even Paul Rudd's comical, over-the-top impersonation in Walk Hard,
Great record.
which was played for gags, is better than this.
With meditation, there's no limit to what we can imagine.
But most egregiously, this man lacks all the charm, humour, and acuteness of John Lennon. He's honestly the worst part of every scene he's in, which is unfortunate because he's in nearly every scene. What's odd about this film is that it easily looks the cheapest and has some of the poorest writing and performances of any of these biopics.
I'm so randy.
But to its credit, it's the only one to use authentic real-life locations. The scenes from John Lennon's school, his childhood home, and even the church hall where John and Paul met are all shot using the real locations where those events took place. It's also the first time that the owner of John Lennon's former childhood home in Menlove Avenue allowed a film crew inside, and even allowed them to knock down a downstairs wall to make room for the cameras. This resulted in 150 leftover bricks which were sold to Beatles fans. Not really about the movie, just a wholesome, cute Beatles fact. Not to say that using real-life locations in a biopic is going to make or break your film. It doesn't. But I think it does elevate its authenticity even a little. But it's then ruined again by terrible accents and awful wigs. I mean, we have to talk about the wigs for a second. The one the guy playing John Lennon is sporting when he first gets that brush-forward mop top is all wrong. It has way too much length in the back, and then it just gets worse once they get signed. All 4 of the Beatles' hair looks so shiny and helmety. I'm getting a lot of these vibes. Basically, just Google image search Beatles costume and you'll get what I mean. Also, for some reason they got the guy who played Pete Best in Backbeat back for this film. I guess the criteria for playing the role was that you had to have played Pete Best before. I don't know, he still looks nothing like Pete Best. Look, this movie is not completely terrible. Its direction and editing still holds up. There's some detailed, poignant moments between characters that earlier films miss, such as when their would-be manager Brian Epstein observes them playing for the first time and realizes that they're not just talented but really funny as well.
Hey, Paul, you want some McGlossie? No thanks, but if you got some gun, got some ABC. ABC? What kind is that? Already been in June.
And to be fair, it is the first attempt at making a movie about John Lennon's early life, where he buys his first guitar and learns about his birth mother, which at the time was all new territory. The problem is this period of John Lennon's life is just explored and told so much better in our next film, 2009's Nowhere Boy. We go from one of the worst to, in my opinion, easily the best of the Beatles biopics. I'm probably a little biased here. This film came out when I was 19 and a full-fledged Beatles diehard. I didn't even know it was being made, and then one day I was sitting in a Borders, RIP, and I opened up Empire Film Magazine and saw this image of Aaron Taylor Johnson as John Lennon playing his guitar in his room, and I flipped my goddamn lid. I quickly IMDb'd the actors and I learned that I was the same age as the 2 young men playing John Lennon and Paul McCartney, which made me even more excited because it meant that I would be seeing guys my age playing the Beatles. It was also the first major motion picture since Backbeat. Everything else had been TV movies. So I was finally going to see a film about the Beatles in a movie theater. Whew. It's exciting. Okay, the film is based on a biography written by John Lennon's half-sister, Julia Baird. Nowhere Boy covers the life of John Lennon from 1955 to 1960, so about 15 to 19 years old. We see him as a troublemaking schoolboy living with his strict Aunt Mimi after his biological mother, Julia, left him when he was just 5 years old. He eventually discovers that his mother lives nearby, and he forms a close but strange relationship with her. She teaches him how to play the banjo and introduces him to Elvis and rock and roll. He creates the band The Quarrymen and meets Paul McCartney and George Harrison, who joined the group before his mother tragically dies by getting hit by a car. Okay, so let's get the weird stuff about this film out of the way first. I don't even know how to talk about this next bit. Okay, so one of the boldest choices this film makes is the Oedipal interpretation of John Lennon's relationship with his mother, who he's just properly met as a teenager.
Do you know what it means? Rock and roll. Sex.
You're my dream.
Now, what makes this Freudian take on their relationship even stranger is that writer-director Sam Taylor met and fell in love with lead actor Aaron Johnson after wrapping the film and even announced their engagement at the premiere in October 2009. Sam Taylor was 42 and Aaron Johnson was 18 at the time. It's weird. Is it weird? It's a bit weird.
It didn't evolve during the filming because, you know, I was at work, he was at work, it was a work environment, and we didn't really mix the two. So that happened when we finished filming.
Also, we don't really have a lot of evidence supporting this intimate attraction between the real John and Julia. I suppose we can chalk this up to artistic license, and that the interpretation of John as a hormonal, confused young man who adored his newfound mother led to his struggle to develop an appropriate type of bond with her. Look, it's a choice. I don't know if it was the right choice, but there was a lot more to say about this film, so let's talk about it. After watching In His Life, the John Lennon story, I was really surprised by how many scenes in the TV movie were then shot almost the exact same way later on in Nowhere Boy. Like seriously, it's almost like Sam Taylor Johnson was trying to recreate the scenes in their entirety. I mean, Julia teaching John the banjo.
Oh, dirty Maggie May, they have taken her away, and she won't be walking Lime Street anymore. Will the judge he guilty found her? That's for Robin, the homeward bounder. That's dirty Robin, no good Maggie May.
John playing at the church fete and meeting Paul. I mean, look at this. Look at this. Although I don't know if you can call this a direct ripoff, although it may seem like it. Let me explain. These events, like John meeting Paul for the first time, are so well documented, right down to the song Paul played for John when they met.
Well, I got a girl with a wrecking machine when it comes to rocking.
She's the queen. Went to a dance on a Saturday night.
All alone I can hold her tight, but
She lives at 20 and 4 uptown, but the elevator's broken down. Well, it's 1 flight, 2
flight, 3 flight, 4,
5, 6, 7 flight, 8
That to portray it any other way would be inauthentic. Also, the John Lennon story replicates the scene where John finds out Stu dies from Backbeat almost shot for shot, so
Stu died last night, John.
I don't know, everyone's guilty of it. All these Beatles movies are copying each other. So you might be thinking, well, if there's so many scenes that are similar, then how are they that much different in terms of quality? I'll tell you. It's scenes like the one where Julia is teaching John to play the banjo that stick out so much more than in previous films. The direction is so much sharper, and the performance from Johnson is so sincere. You can truly see the fascination on John's face, how this is quickly becoming his new religion. I also love the way they show him improving at the banjo. As opposed to just cutting to a new scene and stating 6 weeks later. That kind of stuff is what makes this the best biopic. It helps that it's more recent and also a major motion picture, but mostly it just balances tone and story so much better than anything we've seen previously. By no means is it a perfect film, but there's so much that I just adore about it. Something that no other film has really tried to aim for until Nowhere Boy is the deep and thoughtful relationship between John and Paul. I mean, it's crazy that this hasn't been explored previously. There's just this sensitivity to how it's executed here that makes it one of my favorite parts of this film. This is a really standout scene here. They're slowly letting their guard down in front of each other. John putting on his glasses.
It's my Buddy Holly look.
Goes to B minor. No, B minor. That's a banjo chord.
And And that shot of their feet tapping slowly to the beat is just beautiful. It just makes you think how much these two would create together over the next 13 years and how it all started with one of them teaching the other Blue Man on guitar. It's just really nice. We then learn about Paul's mother's death, which leads them to a conversation about why music is important to him.
Why do you know so much? I mean, you don't seem like the rock and roll kind of guy.
Well, 'cause you mean I don't go around smashing things up and acting like a dick?
Yeah.
No. It's the music. That's it, it's just music. Simple.
You can really feel the fascination and reverence John has for Paul. Peppered in are these other little moments, like when they're playing a gig and they both thank the crowd at the same time.
Thanks, guys. Thank you.
Planting the seed of friendly rivalry between the two that will come to define their careers. I also love that Johnson doesn't try and do the nasally John voice that so many attempt, but just sounds like a bad impression.
I write stuff. Not songs, more poetry, you know, stories.
And Sangster doesn't do the breathy, whimsical Paul voice.
You know, if we're gonna do this, we should write our own stuff. Then you don't get stiffed by record companies.
And in doing so, they don't appear as caricatures of John and Paul, but believable, humanized portrayals of them. Finally, at the wake of John's mother, Julia, we see the two embrace after Lennon punches McCartney. It's not a true event, but it really works here. The two of them hugging and sobbing is a brilliant way of revealing a major element of what brought John and Paul so close together. The loss of their mothers when they were both just teenagers. It's why this movie hits so much harder than previous ones. The tragedy isn't played melodramatically, but just raw and real. On top of that, Kristen Scott Thomas is incredible as Aunt Mimi and provides a depth to the role that we haven't seen before. She's strict and tough, but you can also see her love and concern for John. She even buys him his first guitar, a scene that shows great depth of character.
Oh, it's £8 and 4 shillings.
Oh, that's not very good, is it, John? Borderline mediocre, if you ask me. Very good would be...
£7 cash.
That's very good.
We know John gets his love for rock and roll from Julia, but Mimi's ability to shrewdly bargain for the guitar with John shows he gets his cunning and quick wit from Mimi. Speaking of wit, this film successfully depicts that famous John Lennon sense of humor, which is something a lot of the other films miss about him, or at least they're unsuccessful in attempting it. He was so damaged and he was so troubled, but he was also charming, witty, and just very silly. And when he finally gets his guitar, we see him just stare at it in awe. Or when he's practicing and notices the calluses on his fingers. So many charming scenes with no dialogue, but they're so effective in our understanding of John as a person. We get a great introduction to George, impressing John by playing raunchy on the bus. True story, and despite this kid looking nothing like George, it works pretty well here. The scene where Julia is killed is hauntingly soundtracked to the homemade recording of the first song John Lennon ever wrote, Hello Little Girl.
Hello, little girl.
The juxtaposition of this innocent, happy song played over the biggest tragedy of John Lennon's life was just such a gut punch the first time I saw this film. And finally, we see the first recording of the Quarrymen, with John, Paul, and George singing In Spite of All the Danger. You can see John grappling with the death and unfortunate circumstances that have plagued his life, but we also see the beautiful musicianship between what would be the biggest band in the world. The song is technically the only song credited to McCartney Harrison, but it still works so well here. Especially because I used to listen to the version on the Beatles anthology and never really thought much of it until I heard it in this film. We end just as John and the group are about to leave for Hamburg, so pretty much where Backbeat begins. And as the credits start to roll, the song Mother from John Lennon's first solo LP starts to play, a perfect way to cap off the best of these biopics. That might seem the perfect point to end on, but I have one more film for you guys. The seventh and final film we'll be looking at today. It's 2010's Lennon Naked. And we are back to the TV movie format, but it's 2010, so hey, at least it's in HD, and the wigs are a lot better. As the title might suggest, it's another movie about John Lennon. This one spanning mainly 1967 to 1970, with a little snippet of 1964 thrown in at the start. So much of it is ground that we covered in John and Yoko: A Love Story, but it is told through the lens of John's daddy issues this time. I don't know how this movie affords it, because it uses 10 real Beatles songs. Never the full length for any of them, but still sizable chunks of many of their hits. I know the hit TV show Mad Men licensed Tomorrow Never Knows for about $250,000, so I have no idea how this telemovie managed to get about a dozen dozen Beatles songs. And it's the first of any of these biopics to actually use the real studio versions. Alright, so what's this movie about? We begin with a black and white sequence of John Lennon, here meant to be 23 years old, being played by Christopher Eccleston, a 45-year-old man, and boy does it show. I don't get why so many of these movies cast old men to play a guy in his 20s. It looks like they're middle-aged dads heading off to some boomer fancy dress party. Brian Epstein, their manager, has informed John that his father wants to meet him, no doubt realizing that John's hit the big time, and despite what he says, John's left to think Fred Lennon wants to exploit his success. The meeting doesn't go well and John leaves. We then get real archival footage of the Beatles, which leads up to 1967 when they're promoting Magical Mystery Tour. Oh, and hey, it's the Hot Priest. Yes, that is Andrew Scott as Paul McCartney, and he does a pretty great job, from the subtle yet effective vocal nuances.
If you do, you do. If you don't, you don't.
To the delicate hand gestures, like him holding his face in his hands here. It's just like the real thing. It's good work. The rest of the film depicts various scenes of John Lennon being generally fed up with everything around him. His wife, his dad, his best friend, his son, press conferences. He meets Yoko Ono and makes wild avant-garde music. Meanwhile, what we get of the Beatles is again limited, but some of them are the most effective of the later era Beatles scenes we've witnessed so far. This particular scene of them discussing how the White Album doesn't seem to make sense as a Beatles album is a definite highlight, but unfortunately not one I can play you with sound due to the BBC's strict copyright claims. We've seen most of what follows, including Yoko's miscarriage and their peace movement from John and Yoko, a love story. And for one final time, we witness the John quits the Beatles scene, definitely handled the best here with a decently written back and forth from John and Paul. Of course, we never see any happy, creative scenes from this later era. Just the usual tension and anger that has come to dictate this time in the Beatles' life, despite there being mounting evidence that the Fab Four were still in mostly good spirits during this period. Stay tuned for the Peter Jackson documentary, which sets out to explore the more happy moments from this time. The film climaxes with the same scenes we've seen from the Linda McCartney story, where John throws a stone through Paul's house after finding out he was the one to publicly quit the Beatles. After this, we get some of the primal scream therapy John underwent after he quit the band, and one more scene with his dad before he and Yoko leave for New York, never to return. After watching this movie, I was surprised by how little I felt from it. Maybe it's because I had previously just watched 6 other Beatles biopics, most of them pretty average. And don't get me wrong, it looks really good. The costumes are super detailed and look very authentic. John Lennon's famous psychedelic Rolls Royce is perfectly replicated. But something about this film leaves me feeling kind of empty. Part of this may be Christopher Eccleston's performance as John Lennon. I think he is a good actor, but here he just gives this dead-in-the-eye portrayal, and he's yet another victim in the Lennon voice attempt where he's letting this vocal impression get in the way of his actual performance.
I'm living in a stockbroker's house and I'm running a company.
The picture that Eccleston and this film paints of John Lennon is one of a cruel and spiteful man, wealthy and immature, with little of the charm and humour often associated with the real John Lennon. And in terms of the other actors, many of them do a decent job, but I'll leave it to Los Angeles Times critic Robert Lloyd to sum up their involvement in this film. Quote, "None of the actors are given enough space to build a solid character either. Even the formidable Yoko comes off as a bit of a simp." Well, and that's my main issue with most of these biopics, particularly the ones that try to cover a long period of time in under 2 hours. The story of the Beatles deserves a longer form vehicle to authentically explore the world they created, the one whose legacy lives on in pop culture right through to today. I would love to see something more like a 3-part movie series, or even a high-budget mini-series that depicts their beginning, middle, and end. And something that is missing from pretty much all of these movies is a thorough depiction of their creative process. I know I'm probably asking for a lot, but something like what the brilliant film Love and Mercy did for the legacy of Brian Wilson when he was writing Pet Sounds. By using hours of real demos, outtakes, and isolated instruments from the Pet Sounds sessions, the film was able to give us an incredibly comprehensive and insightful look into how one of the most beloved and influential albums of all time was created. And the same could easily be done for the Beatles, because we have so much old footage, bits and pieces of audio recordings, biographies, recollections, etc., that have given us detailed accounts of how the Beatles made their music and what inspired them to make what they made. None of it is shown in any of these biopics. What we do have is a considerable amount of depictions of their early years and later years. If you've watched these biopics, then you'll easily know how the Beatles formed and sort of why they broke up. But we don't really get anything that shows us what made them into who we know them as today. We haven't seen anything that helps us understand how they made songs like Tomorrow Never Knows or Norwegian Wood or Within You Without You, these experimental, incredible songs from this middle period of the Beatles that has not been explored in film. How John and Paul wrote together, or what went into creating something like Sgt. Pepper. And we've seen basically nothing of George and Ringo, justice for George and Ringo. George is one of the most interesting musicians of the last 50 years, and he's just in these films. I don't know, maybe all this is untouchable and we should leave this all until Paul and Ringo have passed on and there's some distance to it. But I still think there's a way to tell this story that builds on the legendary legacy that the Beatles created. In terms of future Beatles films, there's of course the documentary that I mentioned that Peter Jackson is making. There's also a film that's going to be starting production next year about the Beatles manager Brian Epstein. And I know, again, it's about someone else and not necessarily the Beatles, but I still think this could give us a bit of an interesting glimpse into that period that Brian was alive and managed the Beatles between 1962 and 1967. Actually a period that we haven't really seen much of at all in these previous biopics, so I'm pretty excited for it. Alright, that's it for this probably way too long video. If you've seen any of these Beatles biopics, please feel free to comment down below and let me know which one is your favorite and why. Don't forget to like the video again and hit subscribe. My name is Elliot. I'm going to be making lots of different videos about lots of different things, probably a few more Beatles ones, so stay tuned for more.